Hi class, we're entering one more module, second from the last, and we're talking about middle and later life families this week. So there's a number of things to explore here and think about. We've addressed these families in many different places. We've talked about abuse in these families. We've talked about them as part of the caregiving process. But it's important for us to understand that this still is part of the family system. Just because your children are raised and grown does not mean you're not still in the process of parenting or that you lose those family involvements. So a number of things to think about within this chapter. And we're going to start with the music, that old music here, as we think about the Beatles. Will you still need me? Will you still feed me when I'm 64? When I get older, losing my head. Interesting as we start thinking about all the processes that go into place as you listen to this music. What is it that makes a person older? 64 today is not old like we once considered it. So it's interesting how different things have come along. People at 64 are still very much a part of the work world and very much active and involved in families. 64 or 65, as Social Security once was put in place, was when people were considered old in 1935. Today, we still have this ageism going on, but the reality of it is this population is working and active and involved. So our second song, in many ways, hits the mark a lot better. You know? I'm 15 for a moment, caught in between 10 and 40, and I'm just dreaming. At teenage years, caught between. I'll let you listen to Fight for Fighting on your own, but think about the fact we've only got 100 years to live. So what's this chapter about? The growing population of the older adults in our society are still part of family. I've given you in this particular section 2 PowerPoints, one for the chapter and one just with the current information. And so let me just pop those up as far as some information for you to examine as you're looking at the process. Now, the truth is, we don't have many choices, do we? We either grow old or we die. And so understanding why this is important, you need to understand what the older population looks like today. So very quickly, the older population is numbered about 41 million in 2011, and that's an increase of 6.3 million just since 2000. Older women outnumber men. Big effects for family, isn't that? No surprise there. Women live longer. Men die younger. And so there's some big issues as we start looking at the numbers. But here's one of the interesting pieces, that if a person reaches 65, the average life expectancy from there is 19.2 years. Now look at the difference between males and females. So the average lifetime, if we consider 65 as retirement, is another 20 years that they still have to support themselves and they still need process. And then there are those, this ever increasing group right here of those that are 100 and more. In fact, the fastest growing segment of the U.S. population is 85 plus. Now, interesting, as we're talking about this, and this data comes from census data and from the AOA site, which is the Americans, older Americans, AOA.gov, the information for them. But it's important for you to remember that for the first time in our history since the Depression, that the average length of age did not increase the last 2 years. So things are changing, aren't they? Yeah. What's the older population? Okay. The number of Americans aged 45 to 64 who reach 65 over the next two decades is increasing by 33%. So the percentages we have now of older adults will only continue to increase. Remember, this is based on birth. And so what we have is those baby boomers coming through that are aging. And baby boomers come from 1946 all the way to 1965. 65, 64 is when the baby boomers stop in the process. So we have this big glut of higher birth rates, and then we'll see the decrease in aging percentages. In Americans 65 and over had tripled since 1900, and the older population is getting older. As you look at these, you start to realize how important it is to understand that growth was slowed in the previous because of the Great Depression, but it's the baby boomers that are pushing through. Okay, so what's the issue here? Well, a number of issues. The minority population is changing and growing. It will be a different population. We've already talked about minorities in this class. You can see how that will affect the information that working with this population will be. Now you're sitting there in the class going, I don't need to worry about aging. I'm never going to work with them. That's not true. No matter what job you do, you will work with older adults because they are populating the society and they have a flexible income. At least at now, the current population is the richest they've ever been of older adults. Now that's going to change as the baby boomers hit. They haven't saved as well for retirement. They don't have the pension systems in place that the previous generations come into place. And when they need help, it is family that helps. You can go through the rest of these slides, and if you've taken social problems, you've already seen these slides in similar form. But keep this in mind and this information to know why it's so important that we face and discuss this issue of families in midlife and later life. And so the numbers of the chapter mimic the more detailed information of the other PowerPoint, and we can see how much things are increasing. Important things to know in this chapter: Social Security is the federal government system for seniors. It's a sponsored cash assistance program. This is not a welfare program, welfare in quotes. This is an entitlement program. People put in to get out. Now, there are max amounts that you will get out, the top earners out there. But if you are not working at high levels, if you've worked lots of minimum wage jobs, you haven't put in as much, you won't get as much out. There are movements to change the Social Security system to a welfare system from an entitlement. Think about how that will affect the populations of the future if that comes into place. Big issues as far as older adults. There's that life stage perspective, that development, that they're fairly in the set pattern that most people experience. And we can see that we have these stages to go through. We go back to Erikson as he talks about the stages of life, and we get to more generativity in our 40s and 50s, and that's serving the community. And then we have that look back at our life, whether we believe in the next stage that we've been successful or we failed. There's the lifespan perspective that claims the development is a lifelong process, and it's multi-directional. Both positive and negative changes make the person who they are and sets up their life and how they handle it. Very interesting as we look at this. And then finally, the one I probably buy into the most, the life course perspective that sees age related to the transitions people have made and how they've progressed and how they've built their social structures. That the historical force, that if you faced a lot of problems in your younger life and coped with them well, the life course perspective says that you will cope with the changes of aging as well. So what are the big issues? Children leaving and returning home. Boomerang children are not an exception today. They are a norm. Children return home after college. They return home after divorce. They return home when they lose their job. Many of them can't survive on their own and continue to be part of the process. That has an effect on the parents' savings. That has an effect on their relationship with their child, both positive and negatives. And we see this transition going on. The relationship between adults and their elder parents can change, or they can remain the same, that the parent is always the parent, but when we see some aging processes coming in place, or children standing up to parents as equals, and there's a different pattern that comes into place. There is a whole amount of research that looks at adults, children, and their aging parents and that relationship. I've not been able to offer that course here at Mansfield, but there's the aging family. Just looking at the aging family from middle years on is a significant piece. And then the sibling relationship. Did you get along with your siblings when you were younger? It's interesting when we study siblings that they have the same core base that you all came out of. You're pretty much the same if you were born within close years of each other. And so you may have gone your separate ways in raising your children, but we see that siblings return to relationships as they age and their siblings age out of their home, and that they have this tie and common bond. Other things about aging is the aging couple, marital satisfaction. By the way, increases when children leave the home usually. It returns to a level that was higher before children were born. It also gives the chance for the couple to interact at a level and see if their communication styles are still workable, or do they only have the kids to talk about. And so we see this looking for marital satisfaction. These are couples that are sexual, and their sexual involvement continues to death in many cases. And it's important to remember that that comes into play as far as what is satisfying and what works. And then the division of household labor is part of the process as well. We go back to our chapter on family work and explore that. You know, aging couples, as far as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, elderly, we have not studied well. And what we are finding as we starting to study them, that there are some significant difference from heterosexual couples, and that there are strong bonds because of that likeness in the relationship. There are different relationships for those that are child-free, whether they have support, but remember the strength of family still comes into place, that many of those that remain child-free have strong attachments to nieces and nephews and are part of that process. And then there's widowhood, a whole issue when we explore that. Who gets the friends when you die? Is that person out there belonging to society? Where is the support? And then there's the grief and the loss of that significant other. Now, Kubler-Ross puts up the grief, which puts us in denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And when Kubler-Ross, she felt it was a straight path. And as she researched it longer and more people studied the process of grief and bereavement, we know that a person can go from bargaining back to denial to depression, back and forth. And there are times that they'll be in acceptance and go back in the process. These are not clear definitions of moving through grief, and people move through grief on their individual basis. Again, not a class that we can spend a lot of time in, but an important class which happens to be offered in psychology here is when we look at loss and grief in that process. It's a course that I got to teach in sociology, but here it's taught in psychology, but they'll pick up those sociological influences. Where do you belong? Who do you fit with? What support do you have? As well as those psychological pieces. So lots to think about this week as you look at it. Health. Daily activities of living are in your other slide series. So there's a lot on it. My master's is in gerontology. I'm considered a gerontologist, a researcher studying these issues, and part of my research has been on the aging. As we looked at couples and how they adapted to stroke and caregiving. I worked and did some research with the Rosalind Carter Institute when I was living in Georgia, and her focus is on caregivers at any age. But what she stated was that you will either be a caregiver, need a caregiver, or know a caregiver. That this is the future of families, is that support of caregiving and supporting the processes within. So, lots to think about here between these two sets of PowerPoints. So what are you going to do? You're going to explore the site, aoa.gov, that I mentioned before. And I've given you no video this week. There are so many movies to watch on this subject. However, I think between the book and the PowerPoints, we've covered it well. And so as you look at this particular topic, understand how important the aging population is. The fact that grandparents are caring for grandchildren at a much higher rate than in the past because of the changing society. Remember, about 12 to 14% of grandparents are actively involved in raising their grandchildren. And of those, at least 7% of them are the primary caregiver for children. Pretty big issues as we look at this process. And when we're talking grandparenting here, remember, grandparents can be as young as 30, their late 30s, depending on their family situation, but grandparents tend to be in their 40s and 50s, and they're already trying to save for retirement. They're not retired, and now they're supporting their grandchildren. Look at the social influences that come into place. So as you explore this module, you know where to go forward with it. And I hope you have a great week. One last module to go. Have a great day.